Welcome back to Sip and Talk.
Hey, everyone.
So sorry we're starting a little late today, but trust us, we've got a seriously packed show lined up for you.
We really do.
We're diving straight into the latest on those Trump tariffs. All right, so Trump's tariffs, it feels like every time you turn around, there's some new twist, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And what our sources highlight is that even with these temporary pauses, the uncertainty is really the key takeaway here.
Uncertainty, right?
Yeah, that Global Times article from May 16th, it points out that China really wants more than just a 90-day suspension.
Just 90 days isn't enough.
Apparently not for them. Their analysts are saying that for any real stability in trade, they need a longer commitment. They seem worried that those tariffs could just snap back the second that window closes.
Ah, okay. So they're maybe hoping for something more permanent. Or maybe a different administration down the line.
Could be. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a potentially bigger problem, right?
Yeah. And then Bloomberg's reporting on U.S.-South Korea trade talks too, right?
Yeah, they are. But the general feeling seems to be that Trump's overall tariff strategy, that's likely to stick around even after this 90-day timeout with China.
So still keeping the pressure on their exports.
Exactly. Keeping that pressure on. What's really interesting, though, is even with this ongoing pressure, we're seeing hints of high-level communication.
Oh, like what?
Well, Trump mentioned the possibility of a call with President Xi Jinping this weekend.
Wow, okay.
Which, suggests that the lines are still open, even if the fundamental disagreements are still very much there.
So when they announced the tariff suspension, the global stock markets got a little excited, right? It felt like everyone took a deep breath.
They did, yeah. Bit of a jump. But Bloomberg also notes that investors are still being pretty cautious.
Why is that?
Well, all this future uncertainty, it kind of acts like a wet blanket on any real long-term optimism,
Makes sense.
And you see the potential real-world impact when you look at a giant like Walmart. Their price increases and more conservative outlook really illustrate how these tariffs can trickle down.
Trickle down and affect what ends up on our shopping lists.
Exactly. It could be a sign of broader inflation, or maybe just that certain kinds of businesses, the ones relying heavily on imports, are just more vulnerable.
Yeah, because if Walmart's expecting to pay more, we're probably going to see that reflected in the prices we pay for, everything from groceries to household goods.
Pretty much. On the flip side, though, it sounds like businesses in China, especially in those manufacturing hubs like Guangdong, were pretty happy about the pause.
Oh, I bet.
Absolutely. The Global Times mentioned their positive reaction. But it's also important to understand that these businesses aren't just breathing a sigh of relief and stopping there.
What else are they doing?
Well, many are actively looking at diversifying their markets. Trying to sell more to other countries so they're not so dependent on the U.S.
A long-term strategy. Smart.
Yeah, trying to ride out these trade fluctuations.
And for folks here in the U.S., especially those, watching their budgets, that pause probably does offer some short-term relief from rising prices.
For sure, some relief. But it definitely sounds like that could be temporary, depending on how these negotiations actually play out.
Right. Always comes back to the negotiations.
Exactly. And that Reuters report from May 14th about adjusting the minimum value threshold.
The de minimis thing.
Yeah, exactly. De minimis for imports. That's another interesting angle. Raising that limit seems to have eased some of the domestic pressure here in the U.S. on those really cheap, low-value imports.
How so?
Basically, fewer of those items are immediately subject to tariffs when they come in under that higher threshold.
Ah, so that might explain why I can still find those super cheap phone accessories online without seeing a huge jump in price right away.
Precisely. That's probably part of it. However, U.S. businesses are still complaining about this de minimis rule.
Complaining? Why?
They're arguing that it creates unfair competition because these low-value goods can come in without the same tariff burden as higher-value items that they might be selling or making.
Okay, I can see that point.
And we're seeing companies like Temu, as the Global Times pointed out, quickly figuring out ways to adapt.
Adapting how?
Like shipping through U.S.-based sellers, for instance, to try and skirt some of these tariff issues and keep prices relatively stable for American consumers.
Interesting workaround. So in the short term, we might not see a massive change in the price of those smaller online purchases from China.
Probably not massive, no. But looking ahead, it sounds like the U.S. might tighten those de minimis rules eventually.
To protect our own businesses.
That seems to be the push, yeah. Which could definitely shake things up for those Chinese e-commerce giants operating here.
Okay, that's definitely something to watch.
That's a really key point. And it connects to the bigger picture, of tariff negotiations with other countries, too.
Right. It's not just China.
Not at all. Trump's statements about India potentially having 0 tariffs on U.S. goods in some future trade deal.
Yeah.
And him encouraging Apple to keep its manufacturing in the U.S. to avoid tariffs. It really signals that he's still planning to use tariffs as a major negotiating tool across the board.
It's like he's saying, you want to do business with the U.S., here are the terms, kind of putting the pressure on.
In a way, yes. And the Bloomberg report reminds us that even with ongoing discussions with, say, South Korea, the expectation is that those higher tariff levels are likely to remain in place for most of our trading partners after this 90-day pause with China ends.
Wow, so broad impact.
Yeah, and what's fascinating is the global impact. APEC's warning that export growth in the Asia-Pacific region is projected to plummet this year.
Plummet? How bad?
Down to just 0.4% growth from 5.7% last year.
Whoa, 0.4 from almost 6%. That's huge.
It's massive. And it really shows how far-reaching these U.S. tariffs are. That drop could mean, longer wait times for the latest smartphone or increased prices for car parts, stuff many of us rely on.
Okay, so it's definitely not just a U.S.-China thing. It really has wider consequences for everybody.
Exactly. And the Reuters report highlighting that Japan's economy actually contracted for the first time in a year because of U.S. tariffs. That really underscores how vulnerable these export-dependent economies are.
Japan's economy shrank.
Yeah.
Yep.
And we're also seeing ongoing negotiations with countries like the UK and Switzerland. And while there's some talk from U.S. Trade Representative Greer about potentially easing some of those additional tariffs put in place during Trump's term.
Some easing, maybe?
Maybe some. But the general 10% tariffs, they seem to be staying for now.
Okay. So slower growth in the Asia-Pacific region could mean delays or higher costs for things like our electronics or cars because those global supply chains get disrupted.
That's a very real concern, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that the U.S. auto industry is reportedly not thrilled about prioritizing a trade deal with the U.K.
Why not?
They're arguing that it kind of ignores the interests of our closer trading partners right here in North America, Mexico, Canada.
Ah, okay. So it shows how these tariff decisions create complex and sometimes conflicting effects across different industries and regions.
Exactly. It's a real web.
Okay, let's switch gears a little bit. Let's talk about some interesting political developments related to Taiwan.
Yes. So on May 15th, 2025, we saw U.S. representatives proposing something pretty significant.
What's that?
Proposing to formally incorporate the Reagan-era 6 assurances into U.S. law.
The 6 assurances. Remind us what those are.
They're a set of principles that have guided U.S. policy towards Taiwan for decades. And the reason cited for putting them into law now is the PRC's increased assertiveness towards Taiwan. Making them actual law would be a big move, and it apparently has bipartisan support.
So if Congress passes this, it would mean no future president could just change these long-standing principles on their own. They'd need Congress.
Precisely. It would require congressional approval to alter them, making them much more deeply embedded in U.S. policy.
Okay, and what are the core points of those assurances?
Well, the key ones include things like the U.S. not agreeing to a set date for ending arms sales to Taiwan.
Okay.
Not revising the Taiwan Relations Act. That's the law outlining the unofficial U.S.-Taiwan relationship.
Right.
Not mediating between Taiwan and China. Not pressuring Taiwan to negotiate with China. And crucially, they also reportedly include the U.S. not formally recognizing China's claims of sovereignty over Taiwan.
Wow. That sounds like a pretty firm statement of support for Taiwan's autonomy.
It really is. And the reasoning behind this proposal is quite telling. We're hearing arguments from Democratic representatives in Congress framing it in terms of a fundamental difference.
Like democracy versus...
Exactly. One side a democracy, one side an authoritarian system, emphasizing that the U.S. won't stand by if peace in the region is threatened.
That kind of framing often comes up during international tension.
Yeah.
Right?
It does, particularly when the U.S. is looking to reinforce its role on the global stage. And, it can also have domestic political implications, potentially serving to rally, support, and differentiate the Democratic Party's foreign policy approach.
Makes sense.
And of course, it's highly relevant to current global situations, the conflict in Ukraine, China's activities in the Taiwan Strait, and the South China Sea.
Right. That whole democratic peace theory idea sometimes gets brought up too.
Exactly. And we're seeing prominent U.S. political figures like former Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell stressing the urgency of strengthening deterrence in the Indo-Pacific.
Sending a clear message.
Yeah, sending a clear and consistent message about the U.S. commitment to its partnership with Taiwan. The underlying message from these U.S. lawmakers seems to be that any military action by the PRC against Taiwan wouldn't just threaten Taiwan, it would also pose a direct threat to U.S. interests in the region.
Okay, so a very strong signal being sent there. Now, there's also some interesting news coming out of Taiwan itself, right? About how they're approaching Taiwanese artists who seem to be publicly aligning themselves with Beijing.
Yes, that's right. Taiwanese authorities are actively investigating Taiwanese artists who have apparently been cooperating with calls from the PRC.
Cooperating how? Like what kind of things?
Things like forwarding messages on the social media platform Weibo that express support for military exercises or unification.
Oh, okay. Public statements like that.
Exactly. A special task force has been created by Taiwan's Mainland Affairs Council, that's the government body that deals with mainland China issues, and the Ministry of Culture. And it's being reported that singer Ouyang Nana is a key focus of this investigation.
So they're actually looking into specific artists who've made these kinds of public statements for potential penalties.
They are. Initial reports suggest over 20 artists have been identified, although, specific names and the results of these investigations haven't been officially confirmed and released yet. But what's really interesting here is the stated goal behind these potential penalties. It's apparently not necessarily about punishing these artists.
Oh, then what's the goal?
It's more about providing them with a legitimate reason to say no to demands from the PRC when they're trying to build their careers in mainland China.
Giving them an out.
Kind of. The idea is to create what they're calling freedom space for these artists.
So it's like saying, look, we understand the pressure you're under over there, and we're giving you a way out by saying you'd face consequences back home if you comply.
Exactly. That seems to be the logic. Without these potential penalties, the artists might feel they have no choice but to agree to these requests to publicly support unification or military actions against Taiwan.
Okay, that's a nuanced approach.
It is. The Taiwanese authorities are also making it clear that artists can't simply say, my management company made me do it.
Can't pass the buck.
Right. Emphasizing that the artists are ultimately responsible for who they entrust to act on their behalf.
That makes sense. You can't really outsource that responsibility. What about when an artist takes on an ambassador role for a city in China, like a tourism ambassador or something? Would that be seen the same way?
Generally speaking, those types of cultural, tourism, or travel ambassador roles for specific cities like Ouyang Nana's role with Jian or Vivian Su and Wang Jing's roles with Taipei, they're not typically considered the same as holding like a formal position within the Chinese Communist Party, the government, or the military.
Okay, that's an important distinction to make. Good clarification. Mm-hmm. And it sounds like Taiwan is also being pretty careful about who they're allowing to come in from the mainland, too.
They are, yeah. For the upcoming World Masters Games being held in Taiwan, 371 athletes from mainland China were approved to participate.
Okay.
However, some potential applicants were rejected.
Rejected? On what grounds?
Based on publicly available information suggesting they might make political statements like displaying the PRC flag or promoting unification during the event or their stay in Taiwan.
So preemptive action based on potential behavior.
Seems like it. And the message from Taiwan is very clear. If any such behavior occurs after individuals have entered the country, their permits will be immediately revoked and they will be quickly deported.
Wow, swift deportation. It sounds like Taiwan is trying to carefully balance allowing for cultural exchange while also, safeguarding its own sense of sovereignty.
Absolutely. Especially in the context of what they view as ongoing verbal attacks and military intimidation from the PRC, often using various events as opportunities or pretexts.
Right.
There's a significant concern in Taiwan that China might try to instigate further incidents, perhaps through military exercises coinciding with President Lai Ching-te's inauguration.
Similar to what happened before.
Yeah, similar to actions after May 20th last year, using those exercises for political messaging. So the Taiwanese government is keeping a very close watch on any movements from the PRC.
Okay. And it sounds like these investigations into the Taiwanese artists are still underway then, looking at past behavior.
That's right. Investigations are ongoing, targeting past behavior.
And they're still in the process of defining exactly what kind of speech would cross the line and potentially lead to penalties.
Exactly. Defining the scope and standards for what constitutes punishable speech is clearly a delicate balancing act, between protecting freedom of expression and addressing national security concerns. It's tricky.
All this talk about tariffs reminds me of something super mundane, kind of silly.
Yeah.
I've been trying to find my favorite brand of hot sauce lately. It's imported, right?
Yeah.
And the price has definitely gone up. Sometimes it's just completely out of stock. It's a small thing, but it's like a tiny example of how all this global trade stuff actually hits us in our daily lives, you know?
Huh. I can totally relate. It's like my morning coffee beans suddenly costing way more. You start to wonder, is it worth the extra expense, or do I need to find a new go-to brand?
Right, the coffee calculation.
It's a small inconvenience, sure, but when you multiply it across so many different products we buy, it really, really adds up.
Totally. But hold on, there's more to unpack here. So to kind of bring it all together, we've taken a look at the constantly evolving situation with Trump's tariffs.
Always changing. Yeah.
The U.S. Congress's move towards potentially solidifying the 6 assurances regarding Taiwan.
A big potential policy shift.
And Taiwan's proactive measures concerning artists who appear to be aligning with the PRC.
All interconnected pieces of a really complex global picture, definitely.
Oh, it really makes you think. How are these big global economic and political shifts going to ultimately impact our day-to-day lives? I mean, are we going to see more price swings like my hot sauce?
Or my coffee.
Yeah. Will these international tensions continue to shape our policies and maybe even our popular culture?
Yeah.
What responsibility do you think artists even have when it comes to political statements in this globalized world?
That's a great question. And it also brings up a bigger thought, doesn't it? In a world that's so interconnected economically and culturally, where do national borders and loyalties really stand anymore? Are these lines becoming more blurred, or are we actually seeing a renewed emphasis on national identity and sovereignty as a kind of response to globalization?
Okay.
We'll be back in a jiffy.
Don't go anywhere, folks. I just want to give another shout out to Micky from Mickytolife. His channel is a treasure trove of inspiration, and he's a huge Sip&Talk fan.
Absolutely. Make sure to check him out and maybe even share your awesome podcast intro with him once you've created it.
All right. Welcome back. Hope you've still got some brain power left after all that tariff talk.
Hey there. Yeah, ready to jump into the next layer of this?
You know it. So if you were with us for the first part, we were pretty knee-deep in the latest on tariffs.
Right.
Now we're going to try and connect some of those dots and, explore how other things are shaping up globally. Okay, so let's unpack this.
Sounds good.
First up, President Trump recently took that trip to the Middle East. It sounds like he brought back quite a bit. What were the big gains for the U.S. there?
Well, the really significant part was just the sheer scale of the financial commitments. I mean, from Saudi Arabia alone, we're talking potential investments up to $1 trillion.
$1 trillion?
Seriously.
Yeah, and get this, $600 billion of that is coming straight from their sovereign wealth fund. Their national savings.
Wow.
And it's not just one thing. It's across the board. Energy, defense, tech, infrastructure, even mining. Okay, so $1 trillion is.
Yeah.
That's massive. And you mentioned defense. I remember hearing something about a huge arms deal.
That's right. It was actually billed as the largest arms sale in U.S. history, clocked in around $142 billion.
Whoa.
But it's important to note this isn't just about selling a few planes or something. It's meant to be a complete overhaul, a modernization of Saudi Arabia's entire weapon system.
Gotcha. So a full upgrade.
Exactly. And beyond defense, they're also planning substantial investments right here in the U.S. Things like AI data centers, energy infrastructure, healthcare, aviation. It's a really broad economic partnership.
So it's deep across many areas.
Yeah, the diversification is key. It signals a potentially very broad, long-term economic alignment.
Okay, so Saudi Arabia is really opening the checkbook. What about Qatar? They were part of the trip too, weren't they?
They were, yeah. The agreements with Qatar totaled over $240 billion. Again, focusing on both economic and military cooperation.
Another huge number.
Definitely. And the real showstopper there, I guess, was the order for 210 Boeing passenger planes.
Wow, 210.
Yep. Worth almost $100 billion. Apparently, it's the biggest single order Boeing's ever landed.
That's got to be good news for Boeing.
You'd think so. And on the defense side, they're also buying U.S.-made armed drones, almost $2 billion worth, and anti-drone systems, too, about $1 billion for that.
Okay, so Qatar gets a shiny new air fleet and boosts its defenses. Now, the UAE, they've been making some noise in the tech world, right? What was their part in all this?
Right, the UAE. Commercial agreements there top $200 billion. But the really big headline is their commitment to invest $1.4 trillion in the U.S. over the next decade.
$1.4 trillion. These numbers are just staggering.
They really are. And if you connect this to their broader ambitions, especially in AI, it gets interesting. The U.S. has approved them to import like 500,000 of NVIDIA's most advanced chips every year.
500,000 NVIDIA chips. What for?
to build out these massive AI data centers. Their goal is pretty ambitious. They want to become the third largest AI hub in the world, right behind the US and China.
Okay, so they're serious about AI.
Very serious. And they're also buying weapons, about $1.45 billion worth from the US.
It really sounds like this trip locked in some major financial wins for the US across multiple sectors. But what's the strategy behind all this? I saw mention something called the Kirkpatrick Doctrine. What's that about?
Yeah, that's a good question. It seems the Kirkpatrick Doctrine is being cited as a kind of guiding principle here. It basically draws a distinction between totalitarian governments and authoritarian ones.
Okay.
The core idea or the insight people are drawing from it seems to be a more pragmatic approach, like prioritizing stability with these authoritarian partners to better counter what are seen as bigger totalitarian threats.
Even if it means maybe downplaying human rights stuff publicly.
That seems to be the implication, yeah. Less public criticism, perhaps quieter support, while focusing on the bigger adversaries.
Okay, can you break that down a bit more? Totalitarian versus authoritarian, what's the key difference in like simple terms?
Sure, think of it like this. Neither are exactly bastions of freedom, right? But totalitarian regimes, think classic communism or some extreme religious ideologies, they try to control everything, every aspect of life, even how you think. They tend to be rigid, expansionist.
Type of control. Got it.
Authoritarian governments, on the other hand, are often more focused on controlling behavior, what you do. They might still be repressive, but potentially more open to change or moderation over time compared to totalitarian ones.
Okay. So one's aiming for your brain, the other's more about making sure you follow the rules? Right. That makes sense. So how does this doctrine influence U.S. foreign policy then? Who do we partner with?
Well, the takeaway seems to be that the U.S. might be less publicly critical on issues like human rights when dealing with countries they classify as authoritarian allies or partners.
So turn down the volume on criticism for some.
Potentially. The focus shifts to distinguishing them clearly from those considered totalitarian adversaries. Countries like Russia, China, Iran often get put in that category.
Right. And for those totalitarian adversaries, what's the approach then?
The doctrine suggests a tougher line, potentially things like subversion or actively looking for alternatives to their leadership.
Interesting. So a quieter approach with some, more confrontational with others? Okay, let's circle back to the UAE and their AI ambitions with all those NVIDIA chips. How does that fit into the bigger picture, especially with the U.S.-China tech rivalry heating up?
Right. This is where it gets fascinating. The UAE's big push into AI, heavily supported by U.S. tech, happening at the same time the U.S. is tightening tech restrictions on China. It really hints at this concept some are calling controlled decoupling.
Controlled decoupling. Okay, what exactly does that mean? Sounds like a fancy way of saying it's complicated.
Yeah. Pretty much. It's this idea that countries are strategically choosing which technological partnerships to deepen and which ones to, well, manage more carefully or even restrict. It's not a total breakup, but more selective engagement.
But why would countries do that? Why not just partner with everyone or no one?
Well, several reasons. You might not want to be overly reliant on just one country for critical tech, right? Diversifying partners gives you options, reduces risk.
Makes sense. Don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. Plus, countries might want to align with partners whose values or strategic interests are closer to their own, or they might want to set their own rules for how certain technologies are used within their borders. The UAE partnering with the U.S. on AI puts them in a strong position technologically while also navigating, their own complex regional dynamics.
Right, playing the field a bit strategically. Okay, speaking of controlling things, let's shift to these chip export controls. It sounds like the U.S. is really tightening the screws, especially on AI tech, trying to keep it out of the wrong hands. What's the latest on that front?
You're right. The trend is definitely towards stricter controls, particularly for AI-related stuff. The recent moves against Huawei are a really clear example.
What happened there?
Essentially, the U.S. banned the sale of Huawei's advanced Ascend AI chips globally. Anyone, anywhere selling those chips could face U.S. penalties. The reason given, national security concerns.
Wow, a global ban. That's serious.
It is. And there's also a new requirement that countries might need U.S. approval before buying certain other Chinese goods, too. It signals a definite hardening of the stance.
So closing loopholes for Huawei. And I also heard something about the U.S. hitting pause on its own artificial intelligence diffusion rules. What was that about?
Yeah, those rules were meant to regulate AI chip exports and were scheduled to take effect next May, but they've been postponed.
Why?
It suggests the government is basically rethinking its whole strategy for controlling AI semiconductor exports. There's even talk they might scrap the existing tiered system.
The tiered system?
Yeah, where countries like China and Russia were put in the highest risk category with the strictest controls. Scrapping that could mean a totally new approach.
So they might get rid of the current system entirely. What would replace it? Any ideas?
That's the big question mark right now. We don't know the specifics. So there's definitely some short-term uncertainty. But the general feeling is that whatever comes next might actually be more precise or potentially even stricter, especially targeting countries like China.
Okay, so a pause, maybe a rethink, but likely still aiming for tight controls on certain countries. But I also heard maybe some easing of rules for allies. Is that happening?
That's a really important part of the conversation. You have major U.S. tech companies like NVIDIA warning that being too restrictive could actually hurt U.S. competitiveness.
How so?
Well, the argument is it could push China to accelerate development of its own advanced AI tech, making them less reliant on the U.S., and it could also limit U.S. companies' access to global markets.
Right, inadvertently helping the competition catch up.
Exactly. So there's discussion about maybe easing some restrictions for allied nations, to maintain that U.S. tech edge globally. But the consensus seems to be that the tight controls on China are likely to remain in place or even intensify.
It really is a tricky balancing act, isn't it? Trying to protect national security without kneecapping your own tech industry.
Absolutely.
And then there was President Trump floating the idea of tariffs on imported chips.
Right.
Like 50 or 100%. How does that fit in?
Yeah, he mentioned that possibility. The idea is to encourage chip manufacturing to return to the U.S. He specifically pointed to Taiwan, which, as you know, is a dominant player in global chip production.
So it's not directly an export control, but it could definitely impact things.
For sure. It's more of a trade industrial policy move, but huge tariffs like that would absolutely shake up the global supply chain and put immense pressure on exporting countries. It adds another layer of complexity to the whole chip landscape.
Man, this chip situation is like a multi-dimensional chess game. Okay, let's get to this phrase, wrong hands. We keep hearing the U.S. wants to prevent AI tech from falling into the wrong hands. Who are the wrong hands, according to the U.S.? Is it just adversary nations?
That's a really central question. Generally, the U.S. defines wrong hands pretty broadly. It's any individuals, organizations, or, yes, nations that might misuse AI in ways that could harm U.S. national security, democratic institutions, or global stability.
So broader than just countries we have issues with.
Definitely. While adversary nations are certainly a major concern, it's not limited to them.
Okay, can you give some concrete examples? Like what specific actions or groups fall under this?
Yeah, recent events give us some clear illustrations. Just recently, the FBI warned about AI voice mimicry scams.
Voice mimicry.
Yeah, malicious actors using AI to perfectly imitate the voices of, say, senior U.S. government officials. They use these fake voice messages to try and trick current or former officials into giving up access to personal accounts.
Wow, that's scary stuff, like a deepfake for audio.
Exactly. And the goal is often to compromise accounts, to target others, steal sensitive info, or drain funds. So that's a clear case of criminals definitely wrong hands using AI.
Okay, so criminals are on the list. What else?
Then you have the whole context around the AI diffusion rules being repealed. The original intent, under Biden, was precisely to keep advanced AI chips away from hostile nations. China and Russia were the primary concerns to prevent military or surveillance misuse. The ongoing worries about Huawei's Ascend AI chips violating export controls globally fit this too.
Right, countries that might use AI for military advantage or spying on their citizens. Makes sense they'd be considered wrong hands. Any other categories?
Well, there's the concern about China's rapid AI progress generally. You had the U.S. investigation into that Chinese AI startup, DeepSeek, and also scrutiny of NVIDIA's chip sales in Asia. The fear is that China could leverage U.S. technology to enhance its military capabilities. Congressional leaders have been very vocal about this, framing China's AI advances as a threat to U.S. national security and calling for stricter export controls.
Using our tech against us, basically.
That's the concern. And then there's the election interference angle.
Oh, yeah, you mentioned that earlier.
Right. During the 2024 U.S. election cycle, intelligence reports indicated Russian operatives were using AI-generated fake videos on social media, spreading disinformation about voter fraud, things like that.
Try and mess with the democratic process itself.
Exactly. That's another clear example of actors the U.S. would consider the wrong hands using AI to undermine democratic institutions.
Okay, so it's a mix. Hostile nations, criminals, and groups trying to destabilize democracy. Let's dig into the why a bit more. What are the fundamental dangers the U.S. sees from these wrong hands having powerful AI?
The concerns really fall into a few key buckets. First, and maybe most obviously, direct national security threats.
Like what?
Like hostile nations using AI for military advancements, think autonomous weapons, sophisticated cyber warfare capabilities. There's also the concern about mass surveillance, using AI to monitor populations, control information, spread propaganda in ways that clash with U.S. values. The idea of advanced AI chips enhancing an adversary's military tech is a core worry.
Got it. Military and surveillance. What about non-state actors?
That leads to the second bucket, criminal activities. We talked about the AI-powered scams, data theft like the FBI warning. AI can amplify the scale and sophistication of these attacks. Breaching personal or government accounts using AI can cause widespread damage and really erode public trust.
And the threat to democracy.
That's the third major area, information manipulation. Using AI to create convincing deepfakes or spread targeted disinformation, like in the election example, can sway public opinion and seriously undermine democratic processes. Plus, AI could be used to generate inflammatory content designed specifically to polarize society.
So, military, criminal, societal threats. Is there an economic dimension too?
Absolutely. That's the fourth bucket, economic and technological competition. The U.S. is concerned about competitors, particularly China, potentially surpassing the U.S. in the global tech race if they get unfettered access to the most advanced AI. This is seen as a threat to long-term U.S. economic leadership.
Right, staying ahead technologically. So, summing it up, the U.S. view of wrong hands covers anyone using AI for crime, threatening national security, undermining democracy, or challenging U.S. tech dominance. And tools like export controls and investigations are the response. But you mentioned controversy.
Yeah, the main controversy comes from within the tech industry itself. Companies worry that excessively strict regulations could stifle innovation here in the U.S., make it harder to compete globally, and potentially cede grounds to international rivals. It's that constant tension.
Protect security versus promote innovation and commerce.
Got it. Though sometimes for diplomatic reasons, you'll hear softer terms like competitors or strategic adversaries.
Okay, so they don't always use the harshest language.
Not always in public statements, no.
Right.
But when it comes down to specific policies, especially things like export controls or defense strategy documents, they are often quite explicit.
Who gets named most often?
China is frequently cited, especially regarding AI, chips, cybersecurity, and military modernization. Russia is consistently named, particularly concerning election interference, cyber activities, and military actions. Iran and North Korea are also regularly identified as threats or countries of concern, usually due to nuclear ambitions, support for proxy groups, or regional instability.
So those are the main ones.
They're the most frequently cited, yes. The recent ban on Huawei's Ascend AI chips and those congressional discussions we mentioned explicitly framed China and Russia as adversaries seeking to undermine U.S. leadership through technology.
Okay, so when the policy requires it, they name names. Are there situations where they deliberately avoid naming adversaries?
Yes, definitely. Sometimes it's purely diplomatic, avoiding public confrontation to keep channels open or de-escalate tensions. Other times it's about policy flexibility, not wanting to lock themselves into a specific stance. And coordination with allies plays a role too. Some allies might be more cautious about directly confronting certain nations, like the EU's sometimes more nuanced approach to China.
Right, you got to keep allies on board.
Exactly. And remember Biden's initial AI diffusion rules. They categorize countries by risk level without making those specific country names public in the rule itself.
So sometimes it's more implied or handled internally. Are there official documents where these adversaries are clearly identified, even if not always shouted from the rooftops?
Oh, absolutely. You have things like the Commerce Department's Entity List, which includes companies like Huawei that clearly signals concerns about the country of origin, China.
Right.
Then there are major strategy documents from the Department of Defense, like the National Security Strategy or the National Defense Strategy. These routinely name China and Russia as primary strategic competitors or threats, and often include Iran and North Korea as well. Intelligence community assessments, like the warnings about election interference or AI development in 2024 and 2025, also frequently identify specific state actors like China and Russia.
Okay, so the official lists and strategies are pretty clear, even if the public messaging varies. It sounds like the U.S. definition of an adversary really revolves around national security, geopolitics, and this intense tech competition.
That's a very good way to put it. It reflects this complex balancing act the U.S. is constantly engaged in protecting its interests while managing international relations.
Well, this has been another seriously deep dive. We covered a massive amount of ground today.
We certainly did.
From President Trump's Middle East trip, all those huge financial deals, to the real nitty-gritty of AI cooperation, controlled decoupling, and this whole evolving landscape of chip export controls.
Yeah, lots of interconnected pieces.
It really feels like it all comes back to the U.S. trying to navigate this rapidly changing global scene, right? Trying to maintain its national security and economic strength above all.
Exactly. And the sheer speed of AI development is just adding this whole other layer of complexity onto existing geopolitical tensions.
Which kind of leads us to our final thought for you, the listener. Here's something to chew on. With AI advancing so incredibly fast and international relations being, well, as messy as ever, how do you think the very definition of national security itself is going to keep changing? And what role is all this powerful new technology going to play in actually drawing those future boundaries?
Yeah, that's definitely something to ponder. Where do those lines get drawn?
Gives you something to think about over your next coffee or whatever you're sipping on.
Indeed.
And hey, if you enjoyed us trying to unpack all this pretty complex stuff, make sure you hit that subscribe button for Sip and Talk.
We really appreciate you tuning in and sticking with us.
Yeah, and hey, don't forget to check out our old buddy Micky's YouTube channel too.
Yeah.
For, well, you know, reasons.
Light chuckle implied. All right, until next time.